Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
I've been working with Human Rights Watch since 1997, and since that time, one of the issues that I've focused a lot of attention on is the recruitment and use of child soldiers around the world in conflict situations. So Human Rights Watch works to document human rights abuses and bring them to public attention, and then focus policymakers and key actors in actions that will prevent further abuses and address the situation. So over the last 20 years, we have investigated the recruitment of child soldiers in conflicts all over the world. So the Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, Uganda, Colombia, Afghanistan, Burma, India. So Sri Lanka is one of those countries where we've done research. So a team of Human Rights Watch researchers went to Sri Lanka in the summer of 2004, I believe it was. This was during the ceasefire between the Tamil Tigers and the government. But we had been told by local sources that even during the ceasefire, the Tamil Tigers were recruiting large numbers of children into their forces and still training them to be soldiers, and that it was a serious problem that deserved more international attention. So we spent time primarily in Batticaloa, Trincomalee, and then went up to Kilinochie. And we identified through local organizations that were providing services on the ground to war-affected families, families that had been affected by LTTE recruitment. And we conducted a whole series of interviews with children who had been recruited by the LTTE and then either escaped or been released to find out about their experiences.
In the report, it discusses tactics the LTTE would use to force children children into joining the LTTE. What were the tactics that they utilized?
Well, this was really interesting, what the LTTE would do to try and get young people into their forces. And we saw a whole range of different situations and strategies. So one of the most common was that families told us that representatives of the LTTE would come to their home if they knew that it was a Tamil family. And they would say, "You're a Tamil, it's your duty to serve the cause. It's your duty to give a son or a daughter, for the struggle." And so they would try to, persuade the family to send a child to join up. Some families would resist. They would say, "No, my child needs to be in school. I don't want them to join. I don't want them to fight." And then what we saw was that the LTTE would make repeated visits to the family, and they would increase the pressure and say, if you don't give a child voluntarily, we will take one by force. Or, if you don't agree to, if your child doesn't agree to come, then we will abduct them. And a number of the cases that we documented, in fact, that took place where a child, would say that they and their family resisted the initial request to join the LTTE, but then the LTTE would come in the middle of the night and take the child with, armed codders to, threaten the family if they resisted. I remember interviewing one girl in particular. Initially, she said that she had joined the LTTE voluntarily. But as I asked her to tell me her story, I realized that it really wasn't true. And her family had experienced this pattern where the Tamil Tigers came repeatedly to the house, each time applying more pressure. And finally, this girl decided that if she didn't go, they might forcibly take her younger sister. And so she agreed to go because she didn't want her younger sister to be recruited as a Tamil Tiger soldier. So that was one scenario. We also heard cases of representatives of the LTTE entering schools to do programs and sort of persuading teachers or principals to give them time in front of classrooms of children to, talk about, martyrs to the cause and talk about the responsibility of children to join. In some cases, there was street theater or, public meetings where people were encouraged to join. I also met a few children who had stories about abuses by government soldiers against their families. And, for example, maybe their mother had been killed or their father had been killed, and they held the government responsible. And in some of these cases, these were children who really wanted to join the LTTE to get revenge. And it was their own choice. They weren't pressured. They weren't coerced. They saw it as something that they wanted to do. Or they believed in the ideology. They wanted a separate homeland for the Tamil people. So that gives you an idea of sort of the whole range of experiences that we came across. But I would say that in the majority of the cases that we documented, there was definitely some element of coercion or threat involved in getting children to join.
If you can, tell me how you came to be with the Tamil Tigers. What happened to you to force you to go with them?
நான் சந்தோஷமாக போகல. இன்னைய வேண்டிய கட்டாயம் அப்படியான சூழ்நிலை. இன்னைய தான் கட்டாயம் கட்டாயம் சண்டை பிடிக்க தான் போகணும். அப்படியான சூழ்நிலையே நாங்கள் இருக்கிறோம். அப்போ அதில் போய் நாங்கள் நஞ்சு கொண்டு போய் 3 வாரம் ட்ரைனிங் தந்தவே. 3 வாரம் ட்ரைனிங் தந்து ட்ரைனிங்டா கட்டும் இது ட்ரைனிங் அதில் அப்படி இருந்து ட்ரைனிங் கடையின ட்ரைனிங் எடுத்து அப்படி மெடிசின் வேலையை விட்டு மெடிசின் வேலை செஞ்சு கொண்டு வாக்கில் அப்படி மெடிசின் செஞ்சு கொண்டாங்க கொஞ்ச நாள் போய் கடைசியில் சண்டைக்கெல்லாம் விட்டு.
You were pretty much 2 years with the LTTE, the Tigers, and during that time the Tiger forces were pushed further and further back until their territory was very small and they were suffering big losses.
நான் வந்த இயக்கம் தோல்வியடையுது அந்த நோக்கத்தை பார்க்கல. நான் என் உயிரை எப்படி பாதுகாக்கணும்னு தான் நான் பார்த்தேன். என் உயிரை எப்படி பாதுகாக்கணும், நான் இப்போ எப்படி ஒழுங்காக இருக்கணும், இனி எப்படி ஸ்கூல் படிக்கணும், எப்படி இல்லை நீட்டாக இப்போ வரமாட்டு அந்த நேப்பில் வந்தேன். இயக்கம் பின்வாங்கன்ற இது நேப்பில் இருக்கல. நான் என் உயிரை எப்படி பாதுகாக்கணும் நேப்பில் இருந்தேன்.
There's a common misconception that the LTT only recruited one child per family, but in your report, it documents instances where that was actually not the case, where they actually recruited, even though one child had served, they recruited their sibling. Can you talk about that?
Sure. There was a young woman that we interviewed who had been recruited by the LTTE sometime earlier, and she had been sent into battle and actually lost her leg as a result of fighting with the LTTE. So she was discharged and she went back home, and her younger brother was caring for her because she had a disability and it was difficult for her to care for herself. And then the LTTE came to their house and started pressuring her younger brother to join. And she told us that she said, I already gave myself to you. I gave my leg for you, and now you want my younger brother? What am I going to do if he's taken from me? Who's going to take care of me? So that was definitely a case where, they were looking for more than one child per family.
The Human Rights Watch report also documents instances where the child soldiers faced severe abuse while they were in duty under the LTTE. Can you speak about that?
Well, after they were recruited, in some cases children were recruited by force and taken to training camps. Sometimes the parents would come trying to find the children, and the authorities at the camp would deny that the children were even there and would allow no contact between the child and their family. The military training that children were given was often quite rigorous. They would have to do very difficult exercises, have to, do a lot of physical training. oftentimes in inclement weather, and there were some children who told us that they were having a really hard time. They couldn't keep up. Maybe they got dizzy when they were asked to run long distances, and they would ask to take a rest, and their commander would say, "No, this is the LTTE. You can't take a rest. There's no rest," and they would be forced to continue on even if it was past their point of endurance. So the training was quite difficult. And children who made mistakes indicated to us that they might be beaten for those mistakes, and definitely if children tried to run away. If they were captured, they were taken back to their training camp and often beaten in full view of other children and other trainees.
My parents didn't know I was a soldier. They thought I'd managed to cross the line to safety, but I got caught. They tied me up in a tree and whipped me, and after that they gave me a 10-day training course, taught me to shoot a rifle and sent me into battle. When people started to flee, I ran away from the tigers and came home. My parents were very happy. I told them that we must cross over to the army side. As we were going, the tigers shot at us. I dived down to escape the fire, but the rest of the family mingled with the crowd, and we all finally managed to get across.
Your question with regard to the demobilization of child soldiers, we wish to emphasize that we do not recruit any underage persons following the conventions of the United Nations, requesting all countries and non-state actors not to recruit children below the age of 18. And we have been releasing quite a large number of young persons, underage persons, and we have handed them over to their parents.
Well, during the ceasefire, what we saw is that the LTTE used that as an opportunity to recruit additional numbers of children, and that recruitment rose during that period. This was in 2003, 2004, and as of near the end of 2004, UNICEF was keeping track of the number of children who were reported recruited, and they had a database of close to 4,000 children that had been recruited since the beginning of the ceasefire. So it was a very large number of children that were being taken during that time.
The Conventions on the Rights of Child prohibited any recruitment or use of children in armed conflict under the age of 15. Did the LTT recruit children under the age of 15 while this convention was still in effect?
There are a number of different international laws that relate to child recruitment. It's customary international law that no child under the age of 15 should be recruited. And in fact, not only that, it's considered a war crime if children under 15 are recruited, whether it's by government forces or by, an armed group like the LTTE. There's also an optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child that says that children under the age of 18 should never be forcibly recruited or sent to fight in hostilities. So what we found in our investigation was cases of children both under age 18 and also children under the age of 15 who had been recruited into the LTTE.
One morning, 2 armed men came to my place. They blindfolded me and forced me into the jungle. I was held for 3 months in a training camp. There were drills. You had to obey.
Cut off from the outside world, the children quickly become slaves to the war. Here, the dormitories of a camp cleared by the army just days ago.
There were 70 of us children in the camp. 2 were under the age of 12. When the army attacked, we all ran. 19 other children escaped along with me.
Children under 18 are vulnerable. They're still developing. They don't have the mental or physical maturity as adults, and so they shouldn't be put into, situations that are particularly dangerous or exploitative. And certainly the use of child soldiers is one of the most dangerous and exploitative situations that you can imagine. So the argument is that only mature adults of 18 years old and older should be used as soldiers. Especially with younger children, there is oftentimes the issue of not fully understanding the implications of what they're being asked to do, being more susceptible to manipulation or to coercion, perhaps following orders more easily because they're not mature enough to really question what they're being asked to do. So there's definitely that element of manipulation and the element of immaturity when it comes to children in armed forces.
6,000 child soldiers have already been identified, though UNICEF puts the actual number much higher.
They are soft minds and it's very easy to penetrate the mind. So I think children can be very easily indoctrinated. Of course, they can be taken in because there's fear. Then you can threaten families and take them if you don't give your child. Poverty. So there are many factors. And of course, the other thing is that you don't have to pay children.
Those that were of age 11 and recruited by the LTTE, would they directly go into combat or were they put on reserve such as an LTTE-run schooling?
We saw a whole range of different activities that children were recruited for. Sometimes they would continue with some schooling for a period of time. We saw that some children were recruited for combat operations, as carrying weapons, being prepared to actually fight. We saw other children trained for other roles. For example, working in administration, helping to keep records, or working as medics, for example, to provide medical care on the battlefield. Some were trained in security and were, used to escort LTTE leaders to try and protect them personally. So they were bodyguards. So there was a whole range of different roles that that children were trained for. And some of it involved more or less education or, preparatory training beforehand.
We feel stalemated by the Karuna group at the moment. We've been negotiating for access to the camps for a long time. The purpose is to verify the recruitment of children, whether they're in the camps and how many there are. We have a list of about 195 children who we believe are with the Karuna group at the moment, and we're not getting any cooperation from the Karuna faction.
Actually, we don't have any need to recruit children or to recruit cadres to our military wing, because the purpose of our military wing is only for our self-defensive purpose, not to engage in military operations. The security of this country is up to the government and the security forces.
During the time when we were in Sri Lanka, this was in 2004, and there had recently been a split between the main faction of the LTTE and what was known as the Karuna faction. Karuna was a high-level leader within the LTTE, and he decided to break off. And so then there was a basically conflict between these two LTTE factions, and there was a point where Karuna realized that his faction was going to be defeated, so he actually released all of his child soldiers. And he had over 2,000 child soldiers in his forces at that point. So these children all went home, but within a very short period of time, the main LTTE faction started trying to track them down and re-recruit them. And what we found was that these children were terrified of going back. Some refused to leave their house because they didn't want anyone to even know that they were there. There were some who stayed in other places, maybe with a grandmother or with a distant relative, because they didn't want to be located with their parents. And, girls who had been in the Karuna faction and who had their hair cut short were particularly afraid to go out in public because they knew that their short hair would identify them as a former LTTE cadre. And so some of them said they really wanted to, stay protected until their hair had a chance to grow back and it was less obvious that they were former LTTE. So, even though there wasn't fighting when we were there between the government and the LTTE, there was still a real climate of fear and, ongoing recruitment, especially among those children who had been released from Karuna.
Certain individuals in the Tamil diaspora have given criticism of your report, stating that the report disproportionately focused on children recruited by Karuna's faction and thus is not an accurate reflection of the LTT's activities.
Well, it's certainly true that the large majority of the children that we interviewed had been in Karuna's faction. So, but we were very clear about that. We were very open about where we did our interviews, that most of our interviews were in Becker and Trincomalee, which was sort of Karuna's territory. And we weren't representing these interviews as representative of all children in the LTTE. At the same time, as I mentioned, UNICEF had been doing systematic documentation, accepting reports of children who had been recruited by, anyone within the LTTE, whether it's Karuna or other commanders, and had come up with a database of over 4,000 children. So, even though the experiences of children with Karuna may have been a little bit different than children with other parts of the LTTE. It was certainly a very widespread practice within the LTTE that children were being recruited and trained to fight.
Chelvin largely blamed the use of child soldiers on the Karuna forces, stating that the child soldiers were overwhelmingly used by Karuna's faction and not the LTTE. What is your reply to that statement?
Well, there's certainly ample evidence that the main LTTE faction was recruiting children as well. It certainly was not only Karuna. And that is held up by both the UNICEF database that was rigorously tracking child recruitment, and also by Human Rights Watch's own research that found that the main LTTE faction was trying to re-recruit these children who had been released by Karuna after Karuna dissolved his faction.
There was an instance in the report where it documents about 250 to 300 parents, due to the fighting between the Karuna and Vani forces, asking for the release of their children. I was wondering if you can speak about that and the significance it had on parents' perception of the LTT and Karuna forces.
Yeah. When families realized that their children might be used to fight against other LTTE forces, they did come together to try and get the release of their children. And there was a very large group of parents that went to, an LTTE camp to try and appeal for the return of their children. And I think, there was, for some parents, that was sort of a tipping point. They could understand their children making sacrifices to fight against opposing forces, but to have their children fighting each other was just something that they found unthinkable. And so parents that maybe before had been reluctant to protest or, ask for the return of their children became emboldened by that situation, and they felt that they could no longer be silent and they needed to, take action together to ask for the return of their children.
A large number of former LTT cadres got married in fear that they would be re-recruited. Why do you believe the LTT did not want to recruit married couples?
That was a common belief that the LTTE primarily recruited, men, women, girls, boys who were single. And there was a belief that if children married, that it would provide some measure of protection from recruitment. As far as the LTTE's rationale for only recruiting single people, I can't answer that. I don't know what the reasoning was.
We have released 350 underage children for the last several months, about 6 months or so. And we handed over the complete list of those children, their names, their addresses, when they were released. All those details were handed over to UNICEF as well as to the negotiating table to the government of Sri Lanka. And this process is continuing. But there were cases, I don't deny it. And some senior cadres who were involved in the recruitment of underage children were dismissed from our organization as a disciplinary action. And it is because it has a far-reaching negative impact on the credibility of the liberation organization, we had to take strong actions. But yet there have been some cases. I don't deny it.
Can you talk about what the action plan was and the LTT's unwillingness to abide by it?
Yes. During the ceasefire, the LTTE signed an action plan with UNICEF. And the action plan was designed to ensure the release of children from LTTE forces and make sure that they received rehabilitation assistance and help reintegrating with society and return to their families. So there were several facilities that were set up in the north to receive children that were being released by the LTTE. But in fact, very few children were ever released and sent to those centers. And the vast majority of children that had been recruited were not released.
As a result of the action plan, UNICEF was given a significant role for monitoring the rights of children. Do you believe it is fair to criticize UNICEF because it provided funds to the TRO and accepted the TRO as an implementing partner for the plan?
The TRO is the Tamil Rehabilitation Organization, and there are many that believe that the TRO was an arm of the LTTE. And so there was criticism at the time of why UNICEF would cooperate with, a civilian arm of the LTTE to facilitate the release of child soldiers from the LTTE. From UNICEF's point of view, they felt that they didn't have a choice, that was the only setup that would be acceptable where they could get an agreement with the LTTE for the release of children. So I think UNICEF themselves agreed that it was an imperfect solution, that that it was not ideal, by any means, but they felt like it was the best situation that they could negotiate.
Why do you believe UNICEF was not able to adequately coordinate with the local NGOs, especially in response to the mass release of children by the Karuna forces in April 2004? And why do you believe UNICEF was reluctant to go into the fields and directly talk to Tamil mothers in order to prevent children from being recruited?
I think UNICEF was doing the best that it could. The situation in April 2004 was that a very large number of children had been released all at the same time. It was like, 2,000 children. And, UNICEF was working really hard to try and set up programs and, help children get home and respond appropriately. But they had not anticipated that kind of, huge event or that kind of massive release all at one time, and probably didn't have the means to coordinate as well as they could have or would have hoped to with local NGOs. So there was certainly some sense by local NGOs that they felt that they weren't getting the cooperation or the coordination from UNICEF that they would have liked, but it was a challenging situation for everybody at that time.
The report discusses the intimidation and the fear the LTT would instill within Tamil families whose children were already enlisted within the LTTE from talking to human rights groups. What effect did such intimidation have in preventing UNICEF from getting transparent information regarding the number of child soldiers serving in the LTTE?
We ran across cases where families were told that they should not talk to outsiders. And so that was clearly a reference to UNICEF, to Human Rights Watch, and certainly UNICEF officials believed that there were cases that were never reported because families were afraid to give that information to UNICEF and that there might be reprisals to those families afterwards. So what we can say is that, the number of cases that were reported were probably just a segment of the total number of cases, and that there were many cases that were never reported because families were too fearful.
Has Human Rights Watch been following the rehabilitation process many ex-child soldiers are now undergoing? If so, what can you tell us about that?
I wish we had more information about how the rehabilitation process has taken place. By now, here it is 2016, almost virtually all of the children who were once with the LTTE would now be adults. Unfortunately, we don't have the resources to have followed the entire process to, see what kind of assistance children have received, whether they got the kind of vocational training or, support to get back into school or to be able to hold civilian jobs. I wish we had more information about that, to be honest.
What do you say? I get this all the time personally, and I just want you to respond on it. But what do you say to people that cut the LTT some slack? They were trying to gain a separate state. They needed soldiers to fight for this cause. There was a small population of Tamils, and as a result, they had to resort to desperate means. I get this all the time, so I just want to know, what do you say to people that say that?
Yeah. Well, if you accept the idea that the cause was just, every party to armed conflict, whether they're an armed group or a government, should be willing to abide by the laws of war. And the laws of war are there for a reason. They've been agreed by, universally that there are certain things that you don't do. You don't kill civilians. You don't torture prisoners of war. And in part, these laws were agreed so that, parties would know that the other side was going to adhere to a certain level of decency. And so for decades, it's been agreed that, one of the things you don't do in a conflict situation is recruit and use child soldiers. And that's a basic tenet of international humanitarian law. And even in desperate measures, you don't want to stoop to war crimes. And, using children under the age of 15 is a war crime. No matter, how just people feel their cause is, they should, be able to adhere to certain standards of conduct that, are in line with international law.
I know that you must have received significant criticisms and accusations by members of the Tamil diaspora for writing this report. Are there any accusations put forth by the Tamil diaspora that you would like to clear up right now, which I have not already mentioned?
I'd just like to reiterate that, Human Rights Watch never took sides in the conflict and never made any judgments about, who was right and who was wrong. We criticized both parties to the conflict. In addition to our reporting on LTTE recruitment of child soldiers, we also issued, any number of reports on abuses that were carried out by the Sri Lankan government. We are an objective organization, and we weren't attempting to single out the LTTE for any political purposes, but, it's our practice to document and report on violations of the laws of war. And we've done that in many, many conflict countries around the world, including Sri Lanka.